Act of 2009 created a financial crisis inquiry commission. I'm very pleased, and we are very fortunate today to have as our second keynote speaker the chairman of that newly formed commission. He is Phil Angelides, a man who served for 8 years as treasurer of the state of California, who knows these issues from both a public and a private standpoint. And I have to say to you that I have known Phil for many years. He is a figure of enormous integrity, and he is certainly the right man for this extraordinarily challenging position at this time. So I'm very pleased to introduce to you Phil Angelides.
Hello, it's my pleasure to be with you today, to join your conference as you talk about how we build a more sustainable and economy of broadly shared prosperity. Let me just say that Jamie said we'd known each other for a long time. He didn't fully out our relationship. We are classmates, and we were very active together in Harvard-Radcliffe Students for McGovern, a less than successful enterprise, but one that propelled us with passion then and now. I want to talk today briefly about the work of the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission. I want to talk about our role. I want to talk a little bit about how we intend to go about our role. And I want to talk briefly about what we hope to achieve. Let me take about 10 to 15 minutes, and then what I'd like to do is, before you go on to your next session, perhaps take some of your questions to see if I can give you some answers about how we see our work. As Jamie mentioned, the commission was created in the Mortgage Fraud Recovery Act passed in May of this year, passed by Congress, signed by the President. The Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission is composed of 10 members, 6 appointed by the Democratic leadership of the Congress, 4 appointed by the Republican leadership. We are charged with examining the causes of the financial crisis, writing the official history of what brought our financial and economic system to its knees. We have 2 very specific charges. One is to look at the overall marketplace and economic policy and determine what were the driving forces that led to our financial and economic collapse. We're charged with looking at lending and securitization practices, regulatory actions or inactions, with the global savings and balance, a whole range of matters to really look at the large picture. But we're also charged with examining the causes of the collapse of the major financial institutions that collapsed or would have collapsed but for extraordinary government assistance. And that, of course, means that we will be looking very specifically at institutions like AIG and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and Bear Stearns and Lehman and Citigroup and Goldman Sachs, even though some of them may dispute today whether or not they would have survived but for the massive infusion, direct or indirect, into their coffers. The Commission is really part of a long history in this country of establishing independent commissions on a nonpartisan basis to look at events of consequence for our nation. And in the financial field, there is a legacy here of independent looks, a step away from the daily combat of politics, an official government inquiry, hopefully to help shape policy and reform on a sustained basis going forward. This history reaches as far back as the Aldrich-Vreeland Commission in the wake of the 1907 panic that ultimately led 6 years later to the creation of the Federal Reserve System. And of course, the commission that gets most notoriety as one that had a tremendous impact on our thinking about what our financial system ought to be were the Pecora hearings in the 1930s. Hearings held by the Senate Banking Committee, but named after Ferdinand Pecora, who was the general counsel to that committee, which always leads me to believe or question as an elected official, what the heck was the chairman of that committee doing during those hearings? Getting up late, perhaps drinking a little early, who knows? But Ferdinand Pecora played a great service for this country, because what he did is he stripped the veil back on Wall Street. And he exposed the American people a set of practices that when they saw them, the American people decided collectively they did not want to see them anytime soon again in their financial system. As we begin our work, we take inspiration from what Pecora did, because it was plain and simple. It was an investigation that revealed real practices and real institutions carried out by real people. He marched in National City Bank. He marched in J.P. Morgan. He marched in Chase Manhattan. He marched in the New York Stock Exchange. And people saw a set of manipulations that they vowed that they would not see again. And for decades, we had a steady state financial system, a balance of both innovation and regulation that helped this country have a capital system that supplied capital for the creation of enterprise and value and job creation and broadly shared prosperity. The other commission from which we take some inspiration is a more recent example, not in the financial area, but that was the 9/11 Commission, a commission born in extraordinary controversy, but ultimately a commission with 10 members of both parties who made very clear findings about what happened, what led to our vulnerability to terrorist attack. And of course, some of us have read the report. I did when I became chairman of this commission, but we all remember, or many of us do, of course, in the course of those hearings, hearing some very simple stories that told a larger story about America's unpreparedness. The FBI agents reporting up the chain that there were foreign nationals learning to fly, not land, not take off, big commercial airliners, and no one listening. An August 6th memo going to the President of the United States saying al-Qaeda was committed to strike at this country. And by the way, there would be hijacked airplanes and buildings blown up in New York. And what the 9/11 Commission did was they laid out the facts. And when they laid out the facts, the American people came to a conclusion that this country was ill-prepared for the attack and when the attack arrived. And I hope in the course of our work, if we state evidence, we state facts, and we lay out what happened, this story of the collapse of our financial system can be a cautionary tale that will form future judgments going forward. We're now underway with our work. We've been bringing on our senior staff. Our investigation is rolling forward. We have offices here in D.C., and we are in full gear. So now we're about how we're going to conduct this inquiry. And let me talk to you for a couple of minutes about that. We've been given, I think, a very critical mission. And by the way, I think one that has everlasting impact. Not to say that, I see us as so important for the ages, but one that can't be measured on what impact it has today or tomorrow, but for the long term. In fact, some people have asked me, since the Congress seems to be moving ahead with reforms in the financial system, is the commission of consequence to the American people? And here's my answer. My answer is that true reform does not come with a sweep of legislation alone. A single piece of legislation that creates a new regulatory box in and of itself is not enough. If you look back at the New Deal reforms were a product of many years of discussion about what we wanted our financial system to be. I submit to you, we have regulatory bodies today. If we create a new systemic regulator, what's important is how they look at the marketplace. What's the political will? What's the consensus of this country about the proper functioning of a financial system? And ultimately, true reform is about cultures and values, what's considered acceptable and optimal in the marketplace, and also what commitment you have of the regulatory sector, what capability you have of the regulatory sector. So I believe that this discussion of reform is one that is not about to end, but one that is just beginning. So we've been given something as a task that's very important. And it's critical that we do it without partisanship of any kind, because what has happened here has been of enormous consequences, with both consequences for Americans of all political stripes, and I would also submit to you with likely culpability of Americans of all political stripes. It's a daunting challenge, but I think in the end it's very clear. What we are charged with doing is conducting a full and fair investigation in the best interest of the nation, pursuing the truth, uncovering the facts, and providing a historical accounting of what brought our financial system to our knees. And I believe this accounting is desperately needed. I mean, the fact is that, in the wake of 1929, people were throwing themselves out the windows. on Wall Street. This year, they're lining up for bonuses. There has been no serious self-examination on Wall Street of what has occurred and what should be in the future. I liken it to someone who has had a significant heart attack, who is a bad eater, a drinker, no exercise. 3 weeks later, they're feeling better. And the fact is that the fundamental problems still remain, and so now is a time, I believe, for self-examination. And often people talk about the financial crisis as if it's something that just shook the halls or the streets in New York. But in fact, you and I know it's not so much what happened 14 months ago, the freezing of credit in the country, that's truly of consequence. It's really what's happened in the months since then to the American people. 9 million people have lost their jobs since the downturn. 25 million people in this country who are out of work, underemployed, or have quit looking for work. 2 million Americans who have lost their homes. 10 million have been in the foreclosure process, and likely many more will face that same consequence. Not to speak of the Americans all over this country who, when they go back to work, are going back to work for significantly less than they were working before. My best friend from elementary school lost his job in the real estate industry after 9 months of working at age 56, has now returned to a job that pays him $32,000 a year, raising with his wife 2 children, a 50% pay cut, and this is played out all across this country. There is a hunger on the part of Americans to know what happened. There is a hunger to hold people accountable. There is a hunger to ensure that the people who acted irresponsibly take responsibility. 14 months ago, there was a meltdown in the financial market. Our charge is to take a look at that implosion or explosion and to trace the fuses back to when they were lit and try to give the American people the best sense of what occurred. If we do our work right, I think we'll deepen the national dialogue about the need and the shape of reform. And at this point, I think it's fair to say that we haven't had that robust dialogue. We haven't gotten to the heart of what we want our financial system to be. Do we want it to be a system that is in and of itself money about making money? Or do we want it to be a capital system that in the end is the driving force that helps create jobs and broadly shared prosperity? How we do our work will be fundamentally important. First of all, it's important that we proceed on the basis of facts and evidence, and not according to the opinion or the political leanings of each of our commissioners. So it means that in some thorny areas, we'll look at the facts. As some of you know, there's a very robust debate about, in the subprime area, who led the meltdown. Was it the non-agency, unregulated mortgage originators and securitizers across this country, or was it Fannie and Freddie and the Community Reinvestment Act? I submit to you that the facts will speak for themselves, that if we do our job, we will lay out for people what happened, when it happened, in what magnitude it happened. Secondly, we have an obligation to conduct this investigation with the same seriousness with which the 9/11 Commission conducted their investigation. They held 12 public hearings, and we intend to hold public hearings all throughout next year to lay out for the American people in very clear terms what happened at the institutions that they were called upon to rescue. The 9/11 Commission conducted 1,200 interviews. They reviewed over 2.5 million pages of documents. I assure you, we are going to undertake the same kind of thorough examination. And I will say that it's not really our job to engage in public posturing. People want a serious look at this matter. And people often ask me, are you going to make criminal referrals? We do have subpoena power. We do have the right and the ability and the authority to refer for criminal prosecution. But I submit to you, of all that what we do is find 30 perps and line them up against the wall, we will have undersized this story. The truth is, and you and I know this, that much of what happened in the marketplace was not illegal. It was permitted, and not only permitted, but exalted and applauded by our society. You know, it wasn't many years ago that Enron was America's most admired corporation, where the CFO won CFO of the Year. So as we pursue our work, we will pursue the trails of evidence. If they produce facts, our job is not, as we see it, to embarrass people, but to produce facts. And if the facts embarrass people, so be it. And if, in fact, they unveil wrongdoing, so be it. And finally, I think it's important when we undertake our investigation that we do it in a way that's clear and relevant to the public. There's a lot of jargon on Wall Street. I often thought that Wall Street's very adept at making things complex because it's a good way of patting people on the head and say, don't worry, we can handle all this. So CDOs, CLOs, RMBS, credit default swaps, often things that seem to confuse even the brightest and most tuned in of folks. We see our job is not to dumb down this story, but to make it understandable, to bring to the American people a set of hearings and a report that they will want to read, that's compelling, that's understandable, and will engage more Americans in a debate about our financial future. So what, in the end, do we hope to achieve? There is much anger in this country, and rightfully so. The public's trust in our financial system has been badly shaken. Many Americans who abided by the rules now find themselves out of work, devastated by foreclosures, uncertain of their future prospects. They see continued struggle in their neighborhoods and communities, and they see record bonuses on Wall Street. There is a hunger to see those who profited from irresponsibility to take responsibility, for wrongdoers to be held accountable. But I really do believe that the most important thing that we can do is to shed light and not heat, to unveil what happened so that Americans can have a clear understanding of history so we do not repeat it. And what we do is we help foster the kind of deep debate about financial reform that this country needs and deserves. In the wake of the market crash of 1929, there was a whole generation of Americans who would never put their money at risk in what they saw as the casino of the stock market. The Dow Jones Industrials did not exceed its 1929 peak until 1954, 25 years later. We can ill afford a similar prolonged period of lack of trust. So we hope that we can be contributors to people knowing more about what happened, contributors to fostering a deeper dialogue, and contributors to spurring a debate about what's at the core of what's wrong with our financial system today. I don't really believe, and again, I will hold all my judgments till our work is done, that if we just passed regulation X or Y, that all would have been okay. I really do believe we face a fundamental question of what we want our financial system to be. And I hope we can do work that once again returns our financial system to one that is a supplier of capital for the creation of jobs and wealth for the American people. That's my hope as we undertake this work, and that's my hope for what our country will grapple with in the months and years ahead. Thank you so very much for having me here. And I thought what we do, I wanted to keep that relatively brief, but I thought I'd take some questions then. Yes, and if you can identify yourself.
Lucy Law Webster, on the board of Economics for Peace and Security. The previous speaker said that there was some tension between, everything you said was totally clear, but what he said, which I didn't get a chance to ask about, was...
I'll answer questions about his speech. How's that?
There's tension between the short-term objective of saving the system, on the one hand, and the need to do things like save houses and mortgages and jobs. And I'd like you to comment on that idea, to what extent that is a valid problem, and to what extent one can prevent it from dominating.
I think it's a valid observation. I mean, clearly, the decision to, need to, depends on your perspective, to stabilize the system obviated a level of debate and, in a sense, critical decision-making that otherwise might have occurred. I mean, let's be blunt about this. In the 1930s, the country was in such dire straits that everything was on the table. Does capitalism work, and in what form? You know, the debate across the world was, does democracy work, and in what form? The infusion of more than $1 trillion of capital to stabilize the financial system truncated or, in fact, completely obviated any real debate on Wall Street about the nature of practices in the financial sector. But it then falls to us, I believe, to build a powerful movement to have this dialogue. And what's very interesting to me is, you know, a question reporters often ask me or other people is, Are you concerned about partisanship on your commission? First of all, as someone not from Washington, always concerned about it. I'm always struck by the nature of shirts and skins in this town. Having said that, what I find is across the political spectrum, there is deep concern to deep anger about the fact that there was a rescue of large financial institutions without any rethinking about what has happened and what must happen. So yes, there's been stabilization, but I don't think it needs to get in the way of this critical examination. It's made it, the reality is if the crisis had in fact gone to full bloom, and I'm not advocating that, of course we'd be dealing with the most fundamental of questions. The bailout, in a sense, obviated some of that, but still it falls to us to spur the debate onward. I do not think that the book ought to be closed on this chapter or on this story very quickly. It is just beginning. You know, and you know, keep in mind, people cite the Pecora Commission as our model. I mean, that happened 4 years after the meltdown on Wall Street. And I hope for the best for this country in terms of economic recovery, which doesn't just mean growth in GDP. It means people actually going back to work at jobs, at wages that can sustain their families. And I believe, unfortunately, we're in for a very long season of recovery, and therefore this will remain an issue that gnaws at the American people. Yes, all the way to the back.
Robert Schroeder with International Investors. Let me turn this another direction. We do know that one of the problems in the past has been the shopping of regulators on the domestic side, but we increasingly know that this is a global financial landscape. What has to be done in order to see more international, not just cooperation, but regulational coordination with some teeth to it, so that we don't see international shopping of regulators in an effort to circumvent any law that exists in our country or elsewhere?
Well, you know, your question almost says it. And the fact is that we're mindful at the Commission that we don't operate in a vacuum, either in the macroeconomic sense or in the regulatory and policy framework. And one of the things we've talked about extensively in the last few weeks as we've begun our work is how we also look at what happened in the American regulatory framework in the context of regulatory arbitrage. And hopefully, again, in our work, we can shed some light on that, heighten the issue, and build more momentum around dealing with that. I think around all these issues, we need more momentum, more discussion. There's a whole set of people in this country who want to close the book and get on with business. And I think it behooves us, through the Commission, through other mechanisms, to keep this dialogue open. And we will look at that issue. Let me take, I know you have an agenda. 2 questions, 1 question? Yeah, when I ran for governor in California, I lost to a little-known Austrian guy when he ran for re-election. There's always a joke. The staff would always want me to move to the next event. I'd always agree to take one more question. It was invariably about illegal immigration or the death penalty. So if that's your question, I won't take it. No, go ahead. Yes.
My name is Ben Liu from Chicago. And here we are in the Reagan Foundation, the Reagan Center here. In the 1980s, at the early stage, we heard deregulation, the downsides of the government. And today, we heard all these regulatory agencies to be commissions to be established. I just wonder, is that really a reverse of the so-called philosophy or something like that? But that's not my question. My real question is, I'm from Chicago. Who am I? I'm a professor, very small professor, but anybody read my quality of life indicator studies, probably know that in the 70s. Anyway, I couldn't believe just a few days ago, one of our most prominent Secretary of Treasury come to Chicago and with the Mayor Daley together award $50 million to a private holding company whose name is FBOP, okay? Michael Killer. $50 million from the federal government.
Yes.
Award him for provide community incentives. But in the same day, on Friday, that's Friday morning, on Friday evening, FDIC people and other acquisition bank set into all of these private banks, including National Park, Park National Bank, and so forth, because, you know, he's a holding company, owner of many banks, 3 banks in California, 3 banks
I know
in
the
Texas.
bank. Yeah,
You know that. But this, you talk about irony of this country. Government provide bailout, provide incentive with awarding to this particular person, and yet his holding company was, invaded by FDIC, people and U.S. bank employees trying to take over the banks.
Could you please state your question?
Yeah, my question is, talk about regulation. Here you have a federal government established regulation committees, commissions, and so forth, and award in big newspaper like that.
All right.
And
Well, I'll make this short.
Thank you.
I do think the tension is what you talked about, this stabilization need. And I will say this. I do think, again, this is why we need a debate. There is tremendous frustration and anger across this country when they see tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars stabilizing a financial system without the kind of reforms you otherwise would demand in these circumstances. And I do believe this debate is just beginning, not ending, and I hope you will help foster it. Thank you all so very, very much.